The United States lost a hydrogen bomb in Spain. In 1966, an American bomber came apart over a fishing village called Palomares and dropped 4 of them out of a clear blue sky. 70,000 pounds of burning wreckage fell onto houses, tomato fields, a schoolyard. Each of those 4 bombs was roughly 70 times the power of Hiroshima. 3 would be found on the ground within a day. The 4th would vanish into the Mediterranean for 80 days. What happens over the next 80 days will involve a fisherman who takes on the Pentagon, an ambassador in swimming trunks, and a cleanup that was mostly a lie. And what happens over the next 60 years is worse, because the radioactive soil is still there. And last year, Spain approved 1,600 new homes right next to the fence. January 17th, 1966. For 6 years, America has been flying a mission called Chrome Dome nuclear-armed B-52 bombers in the air, 24 hours a day, every day, waiting for the order to hit the Soviet Union. The logic is pure: Cold War. Bombers already airborne can't be destroyed on the ground. On this particular morning, only 4 of these bombers are aloft anywhere in the world. One of them is called T-16, a B-52 out of North Carolina, coming home along the southern route over the Mediterranean. At 31,000 feet above the coast of southern Spain, it noses in behind a tanker to refuel. A mid-air handshake crews here fly so often, the refueling track has a name: Saddle Rock. The bomber comes in too fast. The tanker's boom operator warns him, "You're going to overrun." Seconds later, the boom punches into the bomber's spine and snaps its left wing off. The tanker is carrying 30,000 gallons of jet fuel. It goes off like a bomb. All 4 men aboard the tanker die instantly. In the B-52, 7 men have seconds to get out. The navigator, Lieutenant Stephen Montanus, ejects. His parachute never opens. 2 more men on the upper deck never get the chance. 4 survive. One of them, badly burned, rides his broken ejection seat all the way down under a half-open tube and lives. Spanish fishing boats pull the Airmen from the sea. One of those boats belongs to the brother of a fisherman named Francisco Simo. Remember that family. Down in Palomares, tons of flaming wreckage have just fallen across the village, and, incredibly, not one person on the ground has been hurt. That is where the luck ends. Within 24 hours, American teams find 3 of the 4 bombs. One is lying nearly intact in a dry riverbed. The other 2 hit hard, and their conventional explosives detonated on impact. There was no nuclear blast. The weapons were designed so an accident couldn't trigger one. Instead, the explosions did something quieter. They blew the bomb's plutonium cores into dust, and the wind spread it over 640 acres of the village. The fields, the crops, the ground people walked on. Washington's response was silence. For 44 days, the United States refused to confirm that anything nuclear was even involved. While 1,600 American troops moved into a tent city on the beat, Franco's censors kept the Spanish press in line. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the cleanup. The Los Alamos scientist advising the operation later admitted what the manual required: coveralls, gloves, hair covered, respirators. None of it was worn. Not because the gear didn't exist, but because officials feared that men in masks would alarm the locals. So American airmen shoveled plutonium contaminated soil with bare faces. One of them, Edward Feely, put it simply: "We spent weeks shoveling nuclear waste without gloves or masks. We ate there and slept there, and at the end of the day, we would be covered in a white powder. That powder was radioactive debris." But the story the world was watching was out at sea, because bomb number 4 was gone. The only piece of it found on land was a metal plate from its parachute housing. The chute had deployed, and the wind had carried a hydrogen bomb out over the Mediterranean. One man had seen it come down, Francisco Simo Ortiz, fishing 5 miles offshore. He didn't know he was watching a bomb. He thought he'd seen half a man falling under a parachute. The Navy threw more than 30 ships, and over 3,000 men are the problem. The admiral in charge described the odds himself. "This is not a needle in a haystack, it's the eye of a needle in a field full of haystacks, in the dark." A Pentagon scientist built a probability map of the seafloor, and early use of the same Bayesian search math that later found lost submarines, and the map's best data point was the fishermen kept telling the Americans their calculations were wrong and kept pointing at the same patch of water. A 3-man research submarine called Alvin went down again and again, 34 dives, more than 220 hours in the dark. In March, Alvin found a track gouged into the seabed, like something heavy had landed and slid, and at the end of it, 2,500 feet down, on a slope so steep the pilots could barely hold position, a white parachute wrapped around a hydrogen bomb, almost exactly where Simo had said. They hooked it and began to lift. The line snapped, the bomb slid away down the slope and vanished, lost, a second time, hundreds of feet deeper. It took another week to find it again. This time, they sent down a Navy robot built for recovering torpedoes, and the robot got tangled in the bomb's parachute. So they hauled everything up together, robot, parachute and bomb, 80 days after it fell. The next morning, the Navy laid the weapon on a ship's deck and marched the world's press past it, widely described as the first time the United States had ever let the public see a nuclear weapon. Not out of transparency. They did it to kill the rumour that the bomb was still missing. The villagers gave Simo a new name, Paco el de la Bomba, Bomb Paco. He hired Eisenhower's former Attorney General and took the United States Air Force to court in New York, because under maritime salvage law, a man who guides you to lost property is owed a share of its value. And the Pentagon had valued that bomb at $2 billion. In 1971, a New York court awarded the man who found America's hydrogen bomb $10,000. While the Navy hunted the bomb, the diplomats staged the show. In March, the American ambassador and Spain's tourism minister put on swimming trunks and waded into the Mediterranean in front of the world's cameras to prove the water was safe. A reporter shouted a question about radioactivity. The ambassador shouted back, "If this is radioactivity, I love it." Here's the thing. The plutonium was never in the water. It was in the village's soil, and the swim did nothing about that. The actual cleanup went like this. The most contaminated 5 acres were scraped up and sealed into steel drums, 4,810 barrels, shipped across the Atlantic and buried in South. The rest, more than 40 acres of contaminated land, was simply ploughed, not removed. Mixed in, plutonium folded into the earth like fertilizer to bring the readings down. Decades later, Spanish scientists found something else. 2 trenches of radioactive debris the US Army had secretly buried on site in 66 waste the operation had claimed to take away. The villages filed 522 claims for their crops, their animals, their land. The United States paid out about $600,000 in total and gifted a desalination plant to the town. And then came the part nobody in Palomares agreed to. Every year since, residents have been taken to Madrid for radiation testing. 60 years of medical monitoring, while the source of the radiation stayed in the ground. A complaint to the European Court of Human Rights later called Palomares what it had become, an open-air laboratory. And the Americans who did the shoveling. The military took urine samples as the men rotated home, and those samples became the basis for every decision about their health for the next 50 years. A peer-reviewed analysis later found the data was close to worthless. Contaminated samples, failed chemistry, readings that didn't fit any model of how bodies actually excrete plutonium. When the Air Force finally reassessed the doses in 2013, it took the 26 most exposed men and assigned every one of the other 1,574 veterans a dose of the least exposed man in that group. In 2016, the New York Times tracked down 40 of the cleanup veterans. 21 of them had cancer. One of them, Victor Scar, filed his first claim in 1998. He fought the Veterans Administration for so long that his case became one of the first class actions ever certified by the Veterans Court. It was overturned on appeal. The Supreme Court declined to hear it. Congress finally acted in 2022, 56 years after the accident. Palomares was recognised as a radiation risk activity. Scar won his own claim the following year. he was 90. And in January of this year, 60 years to the week after the bombs fell, the court told the last surviving Palomares veterans one more time that they could not bring their claims together. 28 years of litigation for one man and counting. Today, behind rusting fences on the edge of Palomares sits 50,000 cubic meters of radioactive soil. Plutonium has spent 60 years decaying into americium, lighter, finer, easier for the wind to lift and for lungs to catch. In 2015, the United States signed a statement of intent to finally take the soil away. It was never carried out. In 2023, both governments promised their technical teams would meet as soon as possible. Nothing has moved. Instead, at the end of 2025, Spain approved 1,600 new homes on land, directly bordering the fenced-off zones. The residents' lawyer says officials told people everything was clean. There's a street beside those plots. It's called Calle Las Bombardas, Bombardment Street. 4 hydrogen bombs fell on Palomares. America got all 4 of them back. The village is still waiting to get back its fields.